This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks. Welcome for coming to the mini med school. It's sort of pediatric mini med school. And this is our first Wednesday night of 6, and we hope to see many of you back for several of the courses. I'm Peggy Weintraub, and I'm going to be giving one of the later lectures about vaccines, but I'm happy to be the moderator tonight for our first talk, which I personally am fascinated to hear. Dr. Marmor, a friend and colleague, has quite a long CV, which I won't read to you, but basically she did her undergraduate work at Stanford in psychology. She went on to Harvard Medical School. She had the good sense to do her residency here at UCSF, where we knew a good thing when we saw it, and we recruited her to stay here on our faculty. She's just done a fantastic job. She does an enormous amount of teaching to the medical students and to the residents. She's won faculty teaching awards. She's just been a real bonus to our department, so we thought it would be appropriate to have her come talk to the mini med school as well. So she has many interests, and her interest in the developing mind of the child stem from both her psychology degree and her ongoing interactions with children and their development, and the medical students and the residents and their development. Well, they're not really children anymore, but they're sort of our children. So it's with great pleasure that I turn the podium over to her, and I hope we'll all enjoy her talk together.
All right, thank you. Welcome, everyone. It's a great honor to sort of be the first speaker for the series on pediatrics, and hopefully, like Peggy said, many of you will come for the additional topics as well. And I hope to start us off on kind of just a fun, light, and interesting topic, which is the mind of the child, and something that I presume everyone here has a particular interest in, or you wouldn't be here. How many people have children of their own? The vast majority. So I'm hoping that this will be as interactive as possible, and people will share anecdotes of their own experiences, their children's experiences, memories from childhood. I'll certainly share mine. There may or may not be a few members of my family in this room who may share stories about me. We'll see if that happens. There's actually very few slides here. What I'm going to do is sort of take you through a little bit of the history of what is known about development in children, specifically focusing on cognitive and social development. And we'll mostly be watching some videos, so examples of kids doing different things to try to illustrate what I think are some of the important concepts to understand about the differences in the way a child's mind works from the way our adult minds work. And please chime in again with any anecdotes, stories, or thoughts that you have in response to these videos. I think that will make the discussion and the lecture much more interesting and rich. So let's get started with just a couple of objectives. What I'm hoping to do today is to really get everyone to appreciate how a child's mind is really unique and different from the adult's mind. The way that children learn at different ages and different stages of their development, they're really set up to learn specific tasks along the way. Before they're ready, they really can't learn what they're not ready to learn, and then once they move on to the next stage, they no longer learn the way they used to learn. So that's a really important concept, I think, to understand that makes children very, very different from the way adults learn. And then I think another really nice thing to think about is not only to appreciate the limits that this puts on the way children can learn at different ages, but actually how at different stages they're really much better at learning certain things than we are. And I think to appreciate that in the children that you know and in the children that you'll see in the videos is really one of the things I enjoy the most about what I do, to see how children are really uniquely set up to learn certain things and to do certain things extremely well at certain times, and it's quite amazing when you can sort of notice that about and appreciate that about children around you. And then hopefully what we'll all be able to do with this is think about ways we can apply these principles in working and parenting and interacting with children around us, educating children, doing whatever it is that you do with children on a daily basis. This talk is not going to be about how to teach newborns to use the toilet. It's not going to be about how to get toddlers to love variety, which no toddler will love, and it's not going to get your child into medical school at age 14. So that, these are a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but the idea is we're not going to talk about how to make your child do certain things at certain ages that they can't, or things like that. So this is really about appreciating the natural abilities of children as they grow and learn, and thinking about how we can really capitalize on those as we interact with kids in our daily lives. So most of what we know about the child's mind and cognitive development is really relatively recent in the 20th century. Before the 20th century, people actually didn't spend a lot of time thinking about children at all. And when they did, it was a very limited view of the child's mind, that it was really just kind of a small and dumb and uninformed version of the adult mind. And that children, were basically these kind of blobs that Freud had all kinds of interesting ideas about the ego and the sexuality and all kinds of things that since then have been really shown not to be as accurate as perhaps people thought they were. But the bottom line is that people really didn't think all that much about what made children different, nor did they put a great deal of thought into how to educate children or how to encourage them to develop well prior to the 20th century. And in this talk, I'm going to introduce you to some of the key players that helped to teach us what we know today about the minds of children. And amazingly enough, most of them were contemporaries of each other in the early 20th century. And most of what we know and still today build on has come from these real pioneers in understanding the child's mind and development. So we're going to talk about a few of those key players and what they brought in, and some of these people, hopefully these are names that you've all heard before, and we'll be talking about each of them and what they contributed. Piaget, Vygotsky, Erickson, Kohlberg, Harlow, Bowlby, and Ainsworth. And again, these men and women were all contemporaries of each other in different parts of the world, but really all part of the early and mid 20th century. And they really transformed the way we think about children. They transformed education. They have transformed the way children in foster care, orphanages are cared for. They've transformed, in my personal experience, the way we treat children in the hospital, children who are sick, the way that we deliver babies and bring them immediately skin to skin with the parent as soon as possible. These are all things that are really born from these innovators in understanding child development. So let's start with Jean Piaget, who is in many ways known as the father of child development. He was a Swiss philosopher. He was also a biologist. He studied mollusks, which are dumb clams, not like children are just dumb adults. But he was very interested in mollusks. He was also a philosopher, and he was an epistemologist. And this is a word I've had to look up many, many times because I keep forgetting what it means. Basically, the study of knowledge. So he was very interested in how we learn, basically, from the very beginning. And he had a very interesting life. He actually spent time working at a school with Alfred Binet, who was the father of the Binet standardized intelligence test, a version of which we still use today. And so he worked with this gentleman who was really an innovator in understanding intelligence, and he worked at a school for boys, and he began to observe things in these children. Most of them were boys. And he noticed that they tended to make the same mistakes over and over and over. And rather than thinking of this as something that was, gee, they just can't learn this, he thought, maybe there's something to this. Maybe there's actually an advantage to the way that children learn, the order in which they learn things. And he began to study and form a theory about the way children actually develop cognitively. And this is really the basis. The theory that he then developed, which I'll describe to you, has really been the basis then of many, many of his contemporaries that have followed and expanded on it. And really what we understand and believe about the way children learn is a version of what Piaget came up with. And what he basically described was a series of stages through which children must develop. And at each stage, they have a unique set of abilities and a unique sort of view of the world that's fairly limited. And then at the next stage, they can sort of expand on that view. And I'll tell you a little bit about those specific stages. The name of his field was called genetic epistemology. And genetic doesn't mean genetic as in the genes. It was about the origins of knowledge. So that was the name of his field of study. And there's a quote at the bottom of this slide. There's going to be a quote on most of these slides for you to read each by the person that is described. These gentlemen and women were really great thinkers and philosophers and had many wonderful and powerful things to say about children and about education. So what did Piaget actually propose? So he proposed these stages of cognitive development, and he said that what drove the progression between stages was a constant push and pull between these two processes of assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is basically taking the world and bringing it into your point of view. So an example of assimilation in an infant would be picking up everything that you see and putting it in your mouth. Accommodation is sort of the opposite. It's taking your worldview and changing it because something in the world doesn't fit it. And an example of that would be an infant that notices that when they throw something, it disappears, but it doesn't go away. It actually comes back when somebody picks it up. They therefore change their worldview from the fact that when things disappear, they are gone, to when things disappear, they're actually still there, they're just out of my sight. So those are examples of assimilation and accommodation. And it was the constant balance between these two that Piaget theorized drove the progression from stage to stage of children's thinking. The other interesting and somewhat unique thing about the stages of Piaget is that the progression in stages he proposed happened in gestalts, which were these little jumps. So basically what he said is that the child would sort of spend time in one of the stages working with the world, interacting with the world, assimilating, accommodating, moving everything kind of into that schema of the world. And once they kind of got it, they would then move to the next stage. And then they would spend time in that stage until everything was sort of in that new schema. And basically each schema was limited because the child would eventually, once they understood the schema and had it completely understood, they would then realize that other things now didn't quite fit in it. They were able to appreciate another level of complexity. And they would have to then develop a new schema in order to appreciate that complexity of the world. So that was his theory of how children actually went from stage to stage. So what were these stages? So the first stage is called sensory motor learning, and this stage spans from birth to 2 years. And within this stage, children actually accomplish a lot of things. As you all know, children change a lot from birth to 2, but the type of learning that they do is very much this sensory motor learning. Sensory motor learning is basically, I interact with the world, I see what happens, and I learn something from it. That's sensory motor learning, and that's really the way children learn before age 2. After that, between age 2 and 7, and so this is sort of the preschool and early school age, children earn this age into this stage of pre-operational thought. And Piaget described this as a stage of sort of fantastical and magical thinking. The world is still very, very egocentric. We all know that children in this age group are not particularly aware of the perspectives of others other than themselves. And I'll show you some examples in just a moment of how profound that can be. It's also obviously a time when language and numbers and all kinds of ways of communicating and understanding the world, the child is very interested in interacting with the world in these ways, using these new, slightly abstract sort of concepts, and then very simple classifications, understanding things like animals and people, and what's alive and what's not, and when something moves, is it a car, is it alive, that type of thing. Simple classifications. So operational thought occurs between age 7 and 11. And this is really where the child is first able to use logic. So actually able to sort of make a mental calculation and manipulate something in their mind without actually seeing if it holds true in the real world, and using that to then learn about the world. So that's logic. Conservation is a wonderful thing that Piaget studied and found very interesting, and I'm going to show you some examples of that in just a moment. Conservation is basically the ability to understand that things like number, mass, and weight don't change when you change the form of them. And I'll show you some examples of that in just a moment. And it's sort of a simple, obvious thing to us, but when you see an obviously very bright child make these errors of conservation again and again and again, that's the type of thing that Piaget noticed that made him realize that children's minds really work differently. It's not just a matter of learning something, it's really about learning in a different way. And then finally, perspective taking, and this is related to egocentrism, basically says that children can't really understand that others may have a different view than they do, and that tends to develop between age 7 and 11. Yes? Yes, the question was, if a child is deficient in one part of these stages, say the child never understands conservation, for example, can they then move on to the next stage? And that's where this kind of very simple, concrete classification breaks down, is that the truth is that you can actually continue to move through stages without having completely mastered one stage, but there may be, obviously our brains work in many different ways, and some people may never become very good at logic and yet are very, very able to understand the perspectives of others, and so definitely everyone's brain is a little bit different, and people move through at different rates and may not completely understand one stage before moving on to the next. But what we notice about children is that it's fairly predictable, and that these are characteristics of most kids between age 7 and 11. After age 11, they take on a new stage, which is the ability to actually manipulate things in hypothetical and abstract ways. And there's some people who never are very good at doing that. And one could argue that these things have a lot to do with culture and education. Piaget did find that these were fairly consistent in other cultures and other countries, but we also know that there definitely are differences across different cultures with different kinds of educational styles. So let's look at some examples. We're going to show some movies. There's going to be a lot of movies throughout the talk. The first movie I'm going to show you is an 8-month-old girl. So she is very much in the early part of the sensory motor stage, and she's going to demonstrate something called object permanence. And this was one of the landmarks of child development that Piaget described. And what that basically is the first evidence of memory. And object permanence is the idea that an object doesn't disappear when it's out of view. And this is something that children learn around 6 to 8 months of age. Before that, something like peekaboo is endlessly fascinating, because you disappear and then you come back and then you disappear and then you come back, and they can do it for hours. It's amazing to them. Once they understand object permanence, something like hide and seek is maybe a little more stimulating, a little more interesting than peekaboo. But that's why peekaboo is so fascinating, because you disappear and then you come back, and it's amazing to them. So we're going to see Claire demonstrate object permanence as well as a great deal of sensory motor learning. So let's pull that up. So everything goes right into the mouth. Let's see what happens when I bang it, see what it tastes like. I'm going to cover it up.
We got a different one. Saw that one, but we didn't love it. So we got a different one that hopefully we'll like. We debated. Trying.
So that's sensory motor learning. So a brief example, but basically a child who is interacting with her environment in order to learn how everything reacts. And you cover up the toy with a piece of paper, she starts to look for it, then she got distracted by something else that was more interesting and went off to that. And that, that's typical of children in this age. Okay, so let's look at some examples of pre-operational thought. And we'll look at a little girl who is age 3, demonstrating the sort of magical interpretive thought of the 3-year-old, I think, in a lovely way. So let's pull her up here. I'm going to skip to we'll watch her.
What is that?
This is Celia, so we're going to see a lot of Celia. She's a friend
Pizza?
of mine.
Do dogs eat pizza?
No, they eat bones.
Dogs eat bones?
Yeah.
What do cats eat?
I don't know.
What do birds eat?
I don't know.
What do you eat?
Pasta.
Yeah, you do. Can you pretend you're eating pasta for Daddy? Good job. Now can you pretend you're brushing your teeth for Daddy? Oh, good job. Good job. Celia, when you brush your teeth, can you tell Daddy what you do when you brush your teeth? What's the first thing you do?
Read books.
Read books? Okay. But you put toothpaste on the toothbrush?
Yeah.
Good. And then what do you do? Okay.
My teeth.
And then when you're done brushing, then what do you do?
Read books.
Okay, do you spit out the toothpaste? Yeah.
Read books.
Let's
Have
read
you
books.
ever seen a dinosaur?
Yeah.
Where?
In a museum.
Oh, was it a live dinosaur?
Yeah.
Really? Or was it a skeleton?
A skeleton.
Oh, do dinosaurs have bones?
No.
They don't have bones?
No.
Do you have bones?
Nope.
You don't have any bones?
Nope.
Duh.
Only dogs.
You what?
Only dogs.
Only dogs have bones?
Yeah.
Really? I did not know that. Do cats have bones?
No.
Do fish have bones?
No.
Only dogs?
Uh-huh.
Wow, you learn something new every day.
Yeah, every day.
Oh.
So the question is, what was she thinking of with the thing with the bones, that, you know, only dogs have bones? And the reason I put that in is that in the earlier clip she was saying, well, what do dogs eat? Dogs eat bones. And so she's associating bones with dogs. And so then she saw a skeleton of she knows those are bones, but you know, that doesn't have bones, I don't have bones, only dogs have bones. So this is the kind of thinking that children in this age have, is they're not really able to classify things, categorize them well, put them together in a way that actually matches the world. She's struggling to find some way of making sense of the world, and the way she's made sense of it is only dogs have bones because that's what they like to eat. So this is not how every child would answer this question, obviously, but that's why I think it's a good example of this kind of thinking. It's not logical thinking, it's trying to make sense of the world around her, basically. Yeah. In general, children respond very well to that. They really want to know about the world. They're not necessarily he's not necessarily going to understand if you say, no, actually you have bones and the cat have bones, and then you ask him again, do you have bones? And you say, no, only dogs have bones. So he's not necessarily going to learn it from the fact that you've told it to him, because he's at a stage when his brain learns by touching things, interacting with things, and not necessarily by understanding them mentally or in an abstract way. But that's how children learn, is by adults, older children, people around them, explaining to them how the world works. And then in combination with their experience, when all those things are consistent, that becomes their new schema of the world. So that kind of communication with a child in this age is not useless. It's not, you know, frustrating to them. It's not necessarily going to make her suddenly get it. Probably won't make her suddenly get it. But it's going to add to the building schema and understanding of the world. And what's so magical about children at this age, and really at all ages, is they're just these sponges of information. They're just trying to take in stuff and have it make sense. And so as much as you can supply some structure or some sort of scaffolding for that, it's a good word for it that's used in the educational literature, that's helpful for the child. Yeah. So the question is, just to repeat the question, you know, is there some level of understanding that the child's thinking is different, and recognizing that and acknowledging that to the child, as opposed to, you know, correcting them and saying, no, you're wrong, this is the right way to do things. Absolutely. And that's where I think appreciating where that child is in their development is so important. You want to sort of recognize that they have basically what Vygotsky called a zone of proximal development, which I'll talk about a little bit later, which is you know, kind of a broad segment of possible development that can happen at any point. And the lower end of it is what the child can achieve by themselves, simply by interacting with the world. And then the upper limit of it is what can they learn with the guidance of a loving adult, older child, caregiver of some type who can help explain the world to them. And clearly the child is going to respond better if it's, you know, a loving person that tells them that, if they tell them in a loving way, if they tell them in an understanding way. Absolutely, that information is going to get in better and be positive, as opposed to something that's done in a punitive way. Absolutely. Okay, so let's look at another example. This is just a profound and very sort of simple example of categorization inability. So one of the other hallmarks of this pre-operational stage is that children are struggling with ways to put things into categories. And I remember a great example of a child that I had in a class that I was teaching about development, and I think she was about a 2.5-year-old child, and her mom said, look, she knows her words, and we were demonstrating how she knew her words, and she held up something, and that, you know, a little doll, and the child said doll, and she held up a banana, and the child said nana, and then she held up a green ball, and the child said apple. So she, you know, had learned that round green things are apples. And there was no sense of, you know, this round green thing isn't something that you can eat, but she sort of got her categories crossed. So this is a movie of a little 4-year-old boy who illustrates that in a profound way. So the child clearly is very bright. He knows what these objects are that the examiner is showing, but he can't quite get the concept of what they have in common.
This is a lion. Who's this?
Bear. Zebra.
And what is this?
A what?
Okay.
So he knows what all
one
those
of
things
these
are.
pictures is different from the others. Can you tell me which one it is? Are they all different?
Yes.
Yes?
this is a lion, this is a bear, this is a zebra, and this is a raccoon. They are all different.
You had to say that 3 of them were kind of the same. Can you tell me which ones are kind of the same?
A little the same.
Mm-hmm. These 2 are?
Yeah.
Can you tell me how?
I'll tell you something. If you take 2 away, there's 2 more left. And if you put them together like this, it makes 4. And if you put 1 under, there's only 3.
That's right.
He's trying to answer her question. He's just hoping he'll get the right answer at some point.
Put another 1 under. Well, there's only 2.
That's right.
And we put them 1 over. There's 1.
That's right.
0.
So you made it go to 1. And then now if I take them all, how many are left? 0.
Yeah, you got the right answer.
Let's go again. What's this?
All right, so she does the same thing. He basically can't do it. So that's categorization. And again, this is a bright child. He knows what those things are. He could tell you what each of those things is. He doesn't get the concept of them having something in common. And that's something that happens during that pre-operational phase, is that children develop the ability to categorize things. And you imagine how much learning we do by making categories. When we know something is an animal, we can say already, right off the bat, it's alive, it's furry, you know, it lays eggs, whatever. We can make a lot of assumptions about that thing before we know what kind of animal it is. And before children can do that, they're basically just taking in information in this kind of random, jumbled way, trying to make sense of it. Once they're able to categorize, then that's one of the things that allows them to move on to the next phase. Were there any questions or comments? Yes. Probably something that you noticed that she did absolutely compulsively for a period of time, and then she stopped and she went on to something else, I'm guessing. And that's the kind of thing you'll see with kids, especially in the sort of toddlerhood age group, is they'll become obsessed with some task they have to master, whether it's, you know, putting things in piles or cleaning up after themselves or whatever it is. And once they master it, they're off, and they're off to something else. And who knows what she's learning by ordering things. But I'm sure it was something brilliant that has allowed her now to go on and be the brilliant child that she is. Any other comments on that? Oh yeah, under, over, around, yeah. And that's what I think is so great about this clip, is this is a bright child, right? He's getting complex, his language is very complex, he knows what each of those animals were, yeah, his math was good. I mean, this was a very smart kid, but he is not ready to categorize things yet. His brain is not ready to do it, and it won't be until it's ready. All right, so this is one of my favorite parts of this, which is the Piaget's conservation tasks, and these are so profound to watch. So these are Clem's kids, and this is Clem Donahue is a colleague of mine who is a pediatrician. His 3 sons, he allowed me to videotape along with a medical student who was interested in development, and we videotaped his 3 sons when they were, I think, 6, 8, and 10. They'll tell their ages at the beginning. And we had them do all kinds of classic tasks of child development. So I'm going to show you the part where they do the conservation tasks. And again, this is about understanding that things like number, mass, volume don't change when you change their configuration. And what's so fascinating about this is that Piaget found that very young children, before age 3 or 4, like around before age 3 and a half, actually can get these things right. You put, 6 coins down on the table, you put 6 coins down, you mix them up in different shapes, and they'll say they're 6. They count them, they're 6. They know how to count, they're 6. And then later they lose that ability. They start to then take in this idea that the size of something tells you how big it is, and that overtakes the ability to count. And that messes up their ability to actually understand conservation. So it's actually almost appears to be a loss of an ability, but really what it is the brain being able to take in new concepts in a new way, and then once they understand conservation, then they're off to other things. So I'll show you 2 of his kids doing some of the conservation tasks so you can see the contrast in their different ages.
I'm Jared, and I'm 6.
I'm Aiden, and I'm 10.
I'm Emmett, and I'm 8, going to 9 in a week.
So 6, 9, and 10. So we're going to look at the 6-year-old and the 9-year-old.
All right, Blue, sit down. All right, Jared, I'm going to show you. We have 6 poker chips here, right? Do you play poker yet?
No.
Okay. Someday you might, if you watch a lot of TV. Get good at this. Are you really smart? Okay. You might be good at poker. So, Jared, are these equal number of chips? Okay. Are they still equal number of chips, or are there more chips in another line?
Equal.
Equal? Okay. What happens if I do this? Equal or more chips?
Equal.
Okay, good.
So conservation of number, most kids around 6 get that concept.
Do they look
See how
about
he
the
does
same?
with length.
Oh, yeah.
No,
Well, close enough, right?
because this one's like that.
Yeah, exactly. So pretend I cut that off, okay? Now they're the same, okay? Now tell me, are these two strings, is one more, less, or the same? These two strings when you compare them.
This is more.
That one's more? How come that's more?
Because it's longer and this one's bunched up.
So that's more string?
Uh-huh.
Suppose I change it and I make this like this and I make this like this. More or less or the same?
That one's less.
This one's less? How about if I do this? More or less or the same?
Less. More.
That's still more? Suppose I do this. Which one's more or less
More.
the same? More. Suppose I do this.
More.
More. These are about the same amount of water, right?
They are the same.
Because we drank the water, right? So how about if I put the water in this bowl, is there more, less, or the same amount of water?
More.
That's more? How come?
Because longer it takes up more space.
Longer takes up more space?
Uh-huh.
Okay. But this one's taller, so why didn't that take up more space?
Because it's like skinnier.
Oh, it's skinnier. Even though it's taller, but it's skinnier? Okay.
Yeah, if you lay this down, it's not as tall as that.
Okay, all right. And you learned that last time you were at UC? You still got that answer right, didn't you? Did you get it wrong last time?
No, right.
You got it like, oh, you got it right both times? Give me 5 for getting them all right. Yeah. So you see these two strings?
So this
Are
is
they
the
the same?
9-year-old.
About the same? Okay. Now we have 2 piles of strings. Which one has more, less? Is it more, less, or the same?
Same.
Same. Are you sure?
Yeah, because this is just shriveled up. Look.
Okay. I think you're right. Okay. Same amount of water in it? Yeah? You think? Looks about the same, right? All right. Now, if I pour this in there, either one have more, less, or the same?
What if there's tiny splashes? And what if the water vapor comes out?
Let's ignore tiny splashes and any vaporizing.
Okay. They're the
More or less the same? Same? Are you sure? Suppose I tilt it on its side, more or less the same?
same.
Suppose I pour all that in there, more or less the same?
More.
Okay, suppose I put this string in there.
More.
More water?
Because this would make it higher. Oh no, same. Because this isn't water.
Would you say they're about the same area? Okay, good. So now if I move these like this, is either one of these more or less or the same?
They're the same.
They're the same, are you sure? Suppose I do this. More or less of the same?
Still the same.
Why is that?
Because they're still the same area.
Okay, good. Suppose
Are these
suppose I overlap them.
questions?
Yes. Are these
They're
what questions?
still the same.
All right, so these so those are Clem's kids. You'll meet them again later doing a bunch of other things. They're very cute. So what you can see, I mean, obviously both very, very bright kids. The younger one just wasn't at the stage yet where he could understand the concept of conservation, but he has a reason. Why is it bigger? Well, because it's stretched out. I mean, it's not like he's just guessing or doesn't know. He's obviously things that are longer are bigger. Duh, Dad. Even though he saw him take the string and squish it up. Yeah. So could the 6-year-old understand the answer of the 9-year-old, like why that was right? Probably not. I mean, you could explain it to him and he would probably go, okay, and then next time you did it, would still get the thing wrong. I mean, that's what Piaget observed basically, is that kids will consistently get these kinds of things wrong until they're ready to learn them. And you saw that he was able to get the conservation of number. So a year before, I had him in the class live, and he didn't get the conservation of number one right either. So, you know, a year later, suddenly he sort of understood that concept and was ready to take it on. But then what Piaget noticed is that number is the first task for children to understand, because they sort of know how to count. And then conservation of length is the next one, and then conservation of volume follows after that. So it's, I mean, you can spend time talking to kids about this and probing their reasoning, and it's fascinating. They just won't get, you cannot teach the 6-year-old about conservation of liquid until he's ready to understand it. All right, let's look at Clem's kids again. So operational thoughts. We're gonna take a little bit out of this egocentric phase and see what happens when you try to get kids to understand the perspectives of others. And one of my favorite classes as a psychology undergrad was a child development class. And as part of that class, we had to do a research project. And I was assigned a research project at Bing Nursery School associated with Stanford. And the research project was basically about this. It was about perspective. And what we did was we took 3- and 4-year-old kids, and there was, so we had the child in the room, and then we had the examiner on the other side of a table. And then we had another adult person, part of the research team, sitting next to the child. So the child was on one side of the table, the examiner on the other. And the examiner would interact with the child and show them like a small toy or a pencil, then put the pencil under a cup and say, what's underneath the cup? And the child would say, the pencil. And they would ask the other examiner, what is underneath the cup? And they would say, the pencil, because we saw you put it on there. And then they look and see, yes, the pencil is there. So once they established both the child and the child's friend there in the room saw that the pencil was under the cup, then the other examiner would leave the room. And the examiner would say to the child, shh, they can't see us. We're going to put something else under the cup. We'd lift up the cup, take out the pencil, and put a little doll underneath, put the cup back down. And then the other examiner would come back in and they would ask the child, does Andy know what's underneath the cup? And what we found is that children who are age 3 will say, of course she does, it's a doll. Because they can't separate what they know from what this other person knows. And around age 4, they can start to recognize, no, she didn't see that we switched out the pencil and put the doll into there. So she thinks it's still a pencil. And that happens around age 3 to 4. So there's various stages of understanding the perspective of others. And I'm going to show you one of the tasks, sort of classic tasks of measuring that in kids. All right, there we go. So this is called What Luigi Sees.
Picture which you think best describes what Luigi can see. Can you see this one?
He's got these objects, and then he's got photographs of the objects from different angles. He's asking the child, which is the one that Luigi can see. Luigi is right here.
Is this his view?
So he has to mentally represent that Luigi's seeing the other side of what he's seeing.
Is this his view? Is this his view?
Nope.
Is this his view?
No.
Is this his view?
No.
Is this his view?
Yeah.
Why do you think this is his view?
Well, I think.
Why is this Luigi's view?
Actually, I think this one is.
That one's closer? Which one's closer to Luigi's view? Which one is Luigi's view?
This one.
This one? How come this is Luigi's view?
Because he's closer to it.
He's closer to which one?
He's closer to this thing.
To which
all
thing?
of this stuff. So.
You think he's closer?
Hold on.
What's his view?
Wait, this is.
Why is this the correct one?
Because this is not in the front, it's
Okay.
in the back.
Right.
Those two are in the back.
Okay. Hi, Luigi.
Alright, so what I'm seeing is this. We can't see this because
to deal with it.
he has to see the oatmeal and then that.
Right.
Bam! He might be seeing this, but that might be a possibility. This, not seeing that. Oh, I think he's probably seeing that on top of that. He's not seeing all of them, like that much. I'm not seeing this. I'm not feeling it, because that was sort of what I'm seeing. Yeah, that is exactly what I'm seeing. This is not what I'm seeing. I mean, he's seeing. This is not what he's seeing. So I think he is seeing this one, because look, can't you see the like little glimpse of the milk carton right there, the big oatmeal, and the Coca-Cola is like right there, so you don't see the whole thing, but then this thing is like right there, like that, so you can really see that. So I think that's what it is.
That's Luigi's perspective. Good.
Good job. All right, so that kid is an expert in perspective taking. So he logically goes through, well, he's closer to this, he's closer to that, this is what I'm seeing, so it's not what he's seeing. The younger child actually sort of accidentally got it right in this case, but he really didn't have a progression or a way to think through it. So that's another classic example of perspective taking. So since Piaget's time, so those were his initial observations. He then went and actually studied and kind of validated some of his observations in both boys and girls. And when we get to Erick Erickson, which I'll talk about, to Kohlberg, who studied moral development, there actually has been a lot of controversy because his initial stages were based on boys only. And other researchers have found that girls actually have a really different view of morality and a different order of stages that they go through. But it seems that the cognitive development stages seem to be somewhat similar between boys and girls. Obviously, there's some subtle differences in the ways boys and girls think, as there are in the ways individuals think, and everyone has their their order and their pace at which they progress through things. But with the cognitive development, it was studied and has been validated in both boys and girls. So the question is about understanding like the passage of time and the ages of people and stuff. If people have, ideas from the children, I don't know of an exact age that when that develops. I'll tell you that kids up until around, 10 or 11 have a great deal of difficulty understanding periods of time. If you say, I'm going to come back in 15 minutes, they have no idea when that is. It might be years, it might be never, it might be in a second. They just have a very poor understanding of how long periods of time are. And that becomes very relevant when you talk to kids about when you're, say, offering a reward for something. You want to make a reward that's very concrete, that is a time unit that they can understand, that they can sort of see the time passing, that type of thing, because kids really just have a very poor understanding of time. But I don't know of an exact age when that actually becomes more clear to them, but I would say not until around age 10 or 11 is when I start to see kids really understand the passage of time. So let's look at one example of operational thought, which is the ability to sort of take the hypothetical and manipulate it in your mind, and actually, rather than having to learn by interacting with the world and seeing how it responds, being able to learn by mentally manipulating things and thoughts and thinking through how things would be. And a nice example of this is the answer to the question, what would happen if people didn't have thumbs? So very different answers to the same question. The first child clearly understood the question and could sort of imagine in a very concrete way, well, you wouldn't be able to do this, and you wouldn't be able to do that, and you wouldn't be able to do this. But the older child really can sort of think, God, this would be profound. The world would be a different place, and things would work differently, and pencils would be shaped differently, and can really sort of take that situation and expand on it within his own mind without really interacting with it directly. All right, so that takes us through Piaget's stages, and that's really sort of the foundation then for most of the other developmental psychologists that came after. And I just want to show you some examples of then how can we sort of apply this in understanding how children learn and then teaching them about the world. And we're going to go back and look at Celia at age 2, and what I think is a wonderful example of her learning from the world, and probably something that all parents are very familiar with. I'm going to skip to get ahead to this.
Sit down.
So here she is at the zoo. Discovered something new that she can do.
You are strong. Oh, are you okay? Oh.
So let's see if she learned something from that. Thinking about it. About it.
Just be careful now.
So she's practicing now. She's practicing what she learned. And practice it again. Make sure you really got it.
Good job, sweetie.
Yeah, that's her
Protecting
head.
your head. Good job. You want to say bye-bye to the camera?
Bye-bye,
Okay,
camera.
bye-bye.
All right, so that's a great example of how children learn, and I think every parent knows this, that your child sometimes has to bonk into things and, stick their finger in something hot before they learn it. You can't teach a child not to do something by telling them what will happen if they don't bend their head as they walk under a railing. But that's how we learn. We don't learn by crashing our cars into things. We learn by learning that if we drive too fast, we'll crash into something. That's something that we as adults can understand. Young children can't understand that. So when we think about teaching children things, it has to be something that is concrete to them, that they can actually relate to and understand, see how it works, see what happens. They're not going to be able to understand simply the warning of what is going to happen as a result of some sort of an action. Okay, so I think we'll actually move on, just so I can get to some of the other topics. We can always come back and learn more from Celia later on. Another interesting application of this, and that I think is very timely as well, as an understanding of how children view media. And when you realize that the way children learn is by interacting with the world, really for the first 7, 8 years of their lives, you understand that media looks very different to children than it does to us. And this was made most profound to me when I was actually a resident in 2001, and the World Trade Center bombings occurred. And I had parents coming in and saying, my child is depressed and is not, recovering from this experience. And I was reading about it and found out that the theory behind that is that the TV monitors in the airports and in people's homes were showing over and over and over and over again this plane crashing into a building. And in the child's mind, this was happening over and over and over and over and over again. And the title of this talk was, how can my child watch The Lion King 50 times and never get bored? Well, because to the child, and this is based on a story, an experience I had recently with a child that was in the hospital, whose mother had other things going on, and so she left him there a lot of the time. And he, every single time I went in to see him, was watching The Lion King. Every single time. He watched it all day, just, on a loop, over and over and over and over and over again. And it struck me at one point I went in and I said to him, he was watching the show, and at one point there's a big lion chasing a little lion or something, or a bird, I don't know what it was, some cartoon thing. And I said to him, do you think the little lion is going to get away this time? And he said, maybe. And I realized, to him, what makes repetition so boring to us is we know it's going to happen the same time, the same way over and over. To the child, the way they learn is that you learn by watching things happen and seeing how they respond. And so when a child sees the same TV show over and over, they see you go peekaboo over and over and over again, or they want to listen to the same song over and over and over again, that's because their brain is primed to learn by repeating things and seeing what happens. So the implication then on media, I think, is really profound. When you think about things that we can easily understand are not real, happened at some time distant from now, happened to people who are not real. Those very sort of simple understandings are not accessible to the child at all. And there's a lot of understanding and a lot of attention being paid now to those effects on the media, and has been fairly consistently shown that that violence in media, that eating patterns in media and commercials, basically everything you see on the TV affects children profoundly in terms of their understanding of the world. And when you realize that that's how children actually learn about the world, it makes a lot of sense. Children are really meant to interact with the world, not watch it on a screen. So I think that's an important lesson for all of us. This is just a video of the World Trade Center. I think we've all seen that enough repetition of that one. We'll just skip that one over. All right, so let's move on to another of the innovators in child development. This is Lev Vygotsky. And he was a contemporary of Piaget, who differed from him a little bit in his theories, but the two of them kind of together really shaped what then came after that. And he was very interested in several areas of child development, in particular play, the role of play. And he was very interested in how culture and play interacted to produce learning in children, and did a lot of studies on that. He was also interested in self-regulation. How do children learn to sort of limit their desires, and things that we all learn that we have to do in order to interact with the world? What is that process like for children? And then he did a lot of work with language as well. And one of his areas of great interest was that culture drives learning. And this is where he differed a little bit from Piaget, in that he thought really that what drove the progression from one stage to the other wasn't so much this kind of universal process, but a sort of cultural process that was happening to the child. And that was what actually caused them to progress from stage to stage. And the two theories really overlap a lot and are probably not all that different, but that was his perspective on it. The human child is uniquely prepared to understand a very, very important piece of being a human, to the point where they actually perform worse on a certain task than a chimpanzee does. All right, so that's an illustration of how important this very human need to do what other people around us do, to learn from others, even when the cognitive abilities tell us that we can just take the shortcut. And that maybe is part of what makes us human. All right, so Vygotsky also introduced this concept of the zone of proximal development that I spoke a little bit about before, which was the idea that children have sort of a span of what they can learn, the lower limit of it being what the child can learn by themselves without any assistance, and the upper limit being what they can actually achieve with the assistance of someone who's guiding them lovingly. And that's really the goal then of good education, is to sort of push that upper limit of that zone, not to go beyond it, and not to let the child sort of flounder along on their own, but really take them to the upper limit of that zone. So I'm going to show you 2 clips here. I'm going to show you a clip of a child playing. All right, so these are a couple of cute videos. The first one is Celia, who's now 3.5 years old, who is playing. And I went over to visit her when she was visiting here in San Francisco. And she didn't have any of her toys or anything with her. And I went and sat down on the kitchen floor with her, and she came up with this game.
Okay, I'm going to clean your house, Rubber.
Oh, thank you very much. It's really dirty.
But it's dirty.
Why is it dirty?
Tracked some dirt in it the other day. I went to the beach and I came back and I had sand in my fur, and I got sand all over the kitchen.
Okay. So I'm going to clean it. I will clean it.
Oh, thank you. It's really hard to pick up the sand because it got all over the floor.
I'm going to clean it. I'm a good cleaner.
A good cleaner.
You're a very good cleaner. Oh, wow, look at that. Okay.
Can you clean my house, Rubber?
Sure, I'd like to clean your house. Why is it so dirty?
Because I threw some sand.
You threw some sand in your house? Why'd you do that?
I threw some sand like this.
Oh. Well, I better clean it up. Let's see, let me get all my cleaning supplies. Okay, I got them. Let's see.
So this game, which of course looks like the most boring thing in the world, this went on for hours, over and over and over again. Rover, why is your house so dirty? Well, I put sand on it. Will you help me clean it up? Yes. So we went over and over and over the cleaning. 6 months later, I went to visit Celia. I had completely forgotten about this game. And as I walked in after having, gotten off the plane and came in to see her, and she came running up to me and said, "Let's play Rover." And I said, "Who's Rover?" Like, I didn't even remember this thing. And this is one of those examples of how children are better at some things than adults are. She had, associated this game with me, and she'd been thinking about it for 6 months since the last time I saw her, and she still remembered the game, and I had no idea what she was talking about, and she pulled out the 2 yellow gloves, and we played Rover in the kitchen for another 2 hours. So clearly this play has some purpose for this child, and whether it's, learning about whether it's bonding with me, which I think was a big part of it, learning about the things that people do on a daily basis. I see people cleaning, I don't really understand why, I'm going to try it out, maybe it's a game. But this playing is clearly about learning for kids, and that's I think the message to take from that. It doesn't take fancy toys or anything to turn something into a game and to teach a child a very important lesson. Another one of the concepts that Vygotsky talked about, and that came up in Piaget's theories as well, is the concept of self-regulation. And a psychologist at Stanford, David Walsh, came up with something called the Marshmallow Experiment. Have any of you heard of this or seen this before? So this becomes sort of a standard way of testing self-regulation in kids. And, the implication of it is that they actually have, as Dr. Walsh said, followed these kids and found that those who showed some ability to self-regulate, whether it was by entertaining themselves or by, somehow remaining in their mind the idea that they were going to get 2 if they waited, whereas other kids, just ate the thing. Even though they understood and they said, yeah, I get 2 if I wait, they just ate it. So what they found is that kids who somehow were either trained or were able to self-regulate in some way, keep that concept in their mind, tended to be more successful in life. It doesn't mean a child who can't do that is going to be a failure in life at all, but that was the concept of the Marshmallow Experiment, yeah. Right. So do you mean that as they become young adults, it's actually harder to delay gratification? Is that what you're saying? Yeah, so I think, in later stages of cognitive development, and I think teenagers are another good example, other things become in conflict. You want me to do this, I'm going to do what I want to do. So there's a whole other level of complexity to the decision. I think with children this young, it's really, can they even regulate themselves or not, and not a choice of whether or not to do it. So they don't even really get the concept or have the skills to be able to self-regulate even if they want to. Every single one of these kids wants the 2 marshmallows, not the 1. But some of them simply can't wait for the 2. So I think later on in life, we definitely see other issues. And there are, you know, people that have, adults that have more trouble or less trouble with delaying gratification, and that, you know, takes on a whole life of its own and has other implications in our lives. But it's a little bit more of a choice. It's a little bit more of a complex cognitive process that we go through, as opposed to these kids who are really just learning the ability to do that. And obviously a younger child, you can't get them to do it at all. I mean, they're not able to. Well, having waited for something and had that gratification come, maybe having successfully delayed the gratification and then having had the increased reward then of having waited. Maybe they haven't had that reward. And I think that's what Dr. Walsh is saying, is basically unless you teach your kids that, you know, there is some reward that will come that rewards self-regulation, they never really learn how to do it. Yeah, it has to attach to an actual experience, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, so I think that's, I mean, the question of is this nature versus nurture kind of idea. I mean, they showed that the two twin brothers there, one of them ate it and the other one didn't. So most of the studies have shown that, you know, there's probably just like with most nature and nurture arguments, that it's probably a complex group of things. But I think the bottom line, since we know how children learn at this age, is they learn by experience. And for whatever reason, if you take one of those twins and the other twin, those two twins have had different experiences in life. One twin's experience has led to the fact that there's some value in self-regulation, and here are some skills of how to do it. And the other twin, for whatever reason, has not learned that, has not experienced that. Yeah. Yeah, and then after that, you know, you see kids do all kinds of creative things, and there's actually hours of footage you can find on YouTube of every single one of these actual kids and what they do, and some of them danced around, and some of like you saw the kid lick the marshmallow, and you know, they come up with all these kind of techniques for how to do it, how to not eat the marshmallow, and yet how to you know, preserve their energy for this 15 minutes, because they have no idea when these guy is coming back, no idea. Okay, so I think we'll skip that one and move on to Erick Erickson. So Erickson was a little bit after Piaget and Vygotsky, and he was really the sort of the father of social-emotional development in children. So he focused a little bit less on cognitive development and more on how kids developed attachments and how their emotional development progressed, and that was his area of interest. He was a very interesting guy because since we've all probably used this phrase many, many times, he actually coined the term identity crisis. And one of the reasons that he may have done this is he actually had a very difficult childhood. He was actually the son of an illegitimate affair that his mother had had with a person who was not his father, and grew up most of his life thinking one person was his father and then finding out someone else was, and really struggling with what that meant for him and thinking about how that affected his development and who he was. And perhaps as a result of that became very interested in studying how children develop their own identities and how early experiences can affect that. And that's really what he developed, is he developed a theory of stages of social-emotional development in kids. And similar to Piaget, there's sort of an order of stages, and the child has to complete one stage before they move on to the next. Unlike Piaget's stages, he specifically talked about the fact that if you don't successfully move through one stage, you still move to the next, but you're left with deficits. So I think any of us who have ever been in therapy of any kind can attest to the fact that we're all left with some deficits from various experiences we've had as children. And what Erickson really did was try to explain what experiences maybe we've had that has left us with the inability to have a successful relationship or stick with one job or whatever it is that, you know, problems we have in our life. So these are the stages that Erickson described. The first one is trust versus mistrust, and that occurs primarily in infancy. And that's really about this bonding period that infants, and I know this as a pediatrician, that children absolutely need a consistent caregiver. There's no question about it. They cannot grow, they can't develop, they can't learn without that bonding experience. And Erickson described that as the trust versus mistrust phase, that if the child successfully experiences the attachment to a consistent caregiver, they develop trust, they develop hope, they're able to then move on and develop other kinds of relationships. If they don't have that early on, they're never really able to trust other people. The next stage in the toddlerhood is, and I think anyone who's ever seen or been anywhere close to a toddler is well aware of the toddler stage, which is autonomy versus shame and doubt. And this is really when the child is trying to understand their role in the world. Do I have control over things, or does someone else have control over things? That is the job of the toddler, and that's what they are there to learn, and darn it, they are going to learn it. So this is just something you see in toddlers. They're out there learning, what is my role, what can I control, what do other people control, and they're going to bump heads against you until they've learned it. Next stage in preschool. In preschool, interestingly, Erickson described, and several of the other people in this talk as well, thought that the preschool time was sort of the most peaceful time of childhood. Children are not particularly bumping heads against anyone else. They're just sort of in this peaceful, sort of happy childhood time. But what Erickson proposed that they're going through on the inside is initiative versus guilt, and they're hoping to develop some sense of purpose in their life. Can I learn how to do things? Can I make friends? Can I tie my shoe? Can I, like my teacher? What can I actually do in the world? Those are the tasks of the preschool child. And then throughout the rest of school age, they're developing in this sense of industry versus inferiority. Basically, can I cooperate with people? Can I have a role in society? It's not so much about what can I do, but what can I accomplish with the people around me? And that's the task of the school-age child. And he actually proposed stages all the way through middle age and old age, and as we continue to develop these things. So I always find this interesting because I always like to sort of look at it and say, did I get through this stage successfully? Did I get through that stage? Oh, I see somebody over there who didn't make it through the first stage, and things like that. So it's an interesting construct. Another important concept that many of these developmental psychologists at this time studied was the concept of attachment. And as I mentioned before, the 20th century, there really wasn't a sense that there was anything important about the caregiver in a child's life. That, certainly kids seemed to like their caregivers, but it was sort of unclear why that was, maybe just because they were around. But people really didn't understand or even conceive of the fact that these early relationships might really have something very profound to do with a child's development, and that without these relationships, a child would not be able to develop normally. So several different people were very interested in focusing on that particular concept. I'll show you a few examples of them. John Bowlby was the first. And he, interestingly, like Erickson, had a very difficult childhood. He grew up in a very affluent family. His father was a physician. He was sent off to boarding school. He actually spent very little time with either of his parents. He was raised primarily by a series of nannies. And as a result of that, perhaps became very interested in the plight of orphan children, children who were left during the war, and really studied their mental and emotional development. He was very interested personally in that. And he became very high and well-known in the educational study. In fact, he wrote the 1951 WHO report on the mental health of homeless children in post-World War I Europe, and was instrumental really in changing in a great deal of ways the way that we treat orphan children, that we treat sick children, and as a pediatrician, the way that we try to keep the parents and the child together as much as possible when the child is ill. Prior to this period, an ill child would just be parked in the hospital and nobody was around to come, and they just cried and nobody really cared or thought that there was anything important about that relationship. And as many of us know from some of the recent news about Romanian orphans and things that has come out in the news recently, that in a lot of orphanages, children were sort of just put in large rooms and nobody interacted with them, and nobody paid attention to their need for some sort of attachment. Yeah. Many of them did. So the Romanian orphans in particular were found in 1989, I think, when the leader of Romania, whose name I can't pronounce, was... Yes, thank you. And people discovered these orphanages where children had been kind of in crowded, horrid conditions, and most of them were adopted in Canada and then followed for many years. And people have been continuing to follow them to see if they're able to develop emotional attachments, able to learn, able to gain back some of what they've lost. And it's been an ongoing kind of natural experiment to see what's happened to those children. Many of them were severely ill with various medical problems and died and just were never able to eat or learn or anything or communicate. Some of them have been able to gain back some abilities. So he was really instrumental, and Harry Harlow was very interested in Bowlby's work and worked with primates. And he did some of the really classic experiment called Harlow's monkey experiments with rhesus monkey, orphaned rhesus monkeys. No IRB would ever approve this nowadays, but it's a pretty classic experiment, and I'll show you a brief clip. And what he did was he took rhesus monkeys, he took them away from their mothers when they were very young infants, and he raised them with kind of a wire doll that had a carpet coating on it and that had a little bottle stuck in it. and the babies would suck on the bottle and get their food and cuddle with the little wire mother, and that became their mother. That was the object of their attachment. And then he was interested in finding out, well, was it simply the food that was provided by this wire doll that caused this attachment, or was it something else? So these experiments really were the first ones to suggest that there may actually be something important in the biological development of an organism that has to do with this early attachment. And these monkeys did not grow. They weren't able to interact with other monkeys. They couldn't be normal monkeys because they hadn't had a monkey mother. And he showed that they did every time they chose the warmth and the comfort of that sort of carpety covering. And they would go and they would sit on the other wire mother with the bottle just to eat, and then they would go right back to the one that was warm and carpety. So there was clearly something about the actual feeling of love and of safety that was what these monkeys were drawn to. And obviously, because they weren't raised by actual monkeys, they were never able to develop normally. But he showed that it was the warmth and the comfort of the attachment, and not just the food that was provided, that was really instrumental. And one of his students was Mary Ainsworth, and she really revolutionized the study of attachment by creating a kind of experimental situation called the strange situation. And she was interested in looking at different kinds of attachments. Might there be different types of relationships that develop between a child and their caregiver that could predict then how healthy and thriving that child can be? So she created this protocol called the strange situation, and I'll show you an example of that. And basically in this situation, you take a toddler and you have them with their parent and in a room playing, and you observe how they interact in the room. Are they exploring? Do they seem to feel safe with the parent? Then you bring in a stranger, and the stranger just at first kind of sits in there so the child can kind of see the stranger, and they're in the room, and you see how they respond. Do they go to the parent? Do they still seem to be comfortable? Then the parent leaves, and the child is left with the stranger. And the next part of the experiment is to see how the child responds. And then the parent comes back, and the final stage of the experiment is, how does the reunion go? So is the child angry at their parent and resentful that they left, or do they rush to them for comfort? So we'll see an example of this, and then I'll tell you as well some of the implications of this that I see on unfortunately a fairly regular basis in my practice. So this is the parent leaves, and the child predictably responds by being in a great deal of distress. And there's nothing that this stranger can do to try to console this child. Nothing she can do. So this is the reunion. Quiets right down. Okay, so that would be an example of what Mary Ainsworth would call a secure attachment, where the child is comfortable when the parent is there. Even when the stranger comes in, the child can tolerate it as long as the parent is there, is immediately distressed when the parent leaves, and then the reunion is one of being happy that the parent has come back, calming down immediately. That was considered a secure attachment. And what she found is that about 60 to 70% of infants had this type of secure attachment, and between 10 and 20% had one of two other kinds of attachments that she called the anxious avoidant and the anxious ambivalent type of attachment. And the clinical relevance of this to me is in looking at children who have been abused or neglected. And as a physician, when I walk into the room in a 16-month-old child, which is the peak of what we call stranger anxiety, if I see a child who is looking terrified on their parent's lap, doesn't seem at all consoled by the parent, that's a little bit concerning. The other thing that's concerning, even more concerning, is a child who immediately runs up to me, gives me a hug, wants to play, doesn't really seem to have any ambivalence about me as a stranger. And that's a pattern that we see a fair amount in children who have been neglected or abused, where they don't have that secure attachment with their caregiver, and they either develop an intense fear of anybody, where there's nobody that can console them, and they haven't developed trust in their caregiver, or they have learned that they seek love from anyone who walks into the room. And I've seen both kinds of coping with that situation in children who have been abused or neglected. And what you hope to see with a secure attachment is a child who is quite comfortable with their parent, but the second you go and you try to look in their ear, they freaking out and they're screaming and crying everywhere. And that's very reassuring, and I tell the parent what a wonderfully developmentally normal child they have. Congratulations. And then what you do, of course, is then you leave the room, and you see as soon as you leave is the child consolable by the parent. The second you leave, the tears are gone, the child is back to feeling absolutely comfortable with the parent. So that's something I observe on a daily basis as a physician walking into the room, and tells me something about the relationship between the child and the parent. And Ainsworth actually did do this experiment in other cultures as well. There was a lot of discussion about whether this was something that was, uniquely American, and perhaps in other cultures the patterns would be somewhat different. And there does seem to be something therapeutic about this early secure attachment that children develop that then allows them to be able to develop successfully after that. All right. So the implication of this, of course, is that there's something really magical and important about relationships. And we think about, what can I teach my child? Can I show them flashcards? Can I, read to them in utero and all this stuff that we do to try to create smart and well-adjusted kids? And perhaps it's something just as simple as providing them with all the love that they need. Yeah. That's a great question. And I think what all of these researchers seem to find is that it's really the quality of the attachment and not the time spent. It doesn't need to be a single caregiver. What matters is that the child has a strong bond with that caregiver. And that is consistently with what Bowlby and Harlow and Ainsworth all found consistently in their research, is that it's really about the quality of the relationship, not the time spent. Absolutely. So I think that's, good news for us in a society where it isn't often one person who's caring for the child. But what we have to do is think about the time that we spend with the child and making that as rich as possible, and paying attention to how the child responds to that attachment. Yeah. Yeah. So the bond is basically how the child responds to the caregiver. So for example, in the strange situation, what they looked at that were signs of the bonding would be, A, does the child feel comfortable exploring the environment when the caregiver is there? So that's a sign that the child feels the caregiver will protect them from things, the caregiver is looking out for their best interest, isn't going to let them get hurt, that type of thing. Is distressed when the caregiver leaves. That's another sign of the bond. So they care, as opposed to the children that I see sometimes who have been neglected, where people come in and out, they don't really care. Whoever's there is the person they're going to go to and who's going to care for them. And then they look at the reunion. So is the child glad to see the caregiver come back? Do they then calm down? Or are they pleased to greet them? Are they angry at them, hitting at them, resentful that they left? So those are the qualities of the bond that they look for, an example in this strange situation experiment. And obviously at different ages, that the way that the bond is displayed is going to be slightly different. So very young infants are not distressed when their caregiver leaves necessarily nearly as much as toddlers are. So there are different stages where the caregiver being around, the quality of the bond, and how you measure the strength of the bond is consistently changing throughout childhood. So we're almost at the end here. I just wanted to show you a brief. I mentioned the Romanian orphans of 1989. There's a number of interesting papers that have been written on them, following them to see if they can actually develop, the ability to attach to people, or if there's some permanent, critical period or critical window that has been passed that means these children can never actually recover. And one of the other interesting kind of natural experiments that came up related to this was the case of Jeannie, who was a little girl, was discovered in the 1960s in a home in Los Angeles, who had basically been completely neglected by her mother, who had some psychiatric illness, and her father, who thought that she was mentally retarded, and that the right thing to do was to put her in a small room and treat her like a baby. And when they discovered her, she was profoundly delayed in all kinds of ways. And physicians and psychiatrists were extremely excited about this being the opportunity to basically show that they could teach her how to interact, teach her the things that she had missed. And the problem with this natural experiment is that they never figured out whether she actually was mentally retarded or delayed in some way, or whether all of her deficits were due to the treatment that she had received. She was a very interesting case, and the scientists, like I said, got very excited about her case. They were able to teach her a few simple words. She was able to form attachments with one or two of the physicians who worked with her significantly. She was at one point fostered by one of the physicians for a couple of years, but because she was actually quite difficult to take care of and still profoundly delayed, actually ended up then going back to live with her mother, and has since then disappeared and been away from the media site. So a very interesting story, not one that necessarily answers a lot of questions, but illustrates, I think, some of the difficulties of separating out what's the effect of this, incredibly difficult childhood and period that she had versus maybe what might have been some underlying problems with her development. It's a long and interesting story, actually. The whole BBC documentary you can get online. And what happened was that after many, many years, people became very angered by how the physicians were treating her like an experiment, and there was a lot of media attention out of it. And the mother then came out of hiding and said, I want my daughter back. And she got a lot of advocates and lawyers on her side saying that she had wanted to actually love the child and take her away from the media attention. That was what she really needed. It was a huge, big, controversial thing, but she eventually went back to the mother. It's interesting. All right. So the last thing we're going to talk about is a little bit about moral development in kids. And I did want to mention Lawrence Kohlberg, who was instrumental in discussing how children learn what is right and wrong and develop a sense of morality in the world. And he described these 6 stages of moral development, which, as I mentioned, were somewhat controversial because they were based on studies only in boys. And Carol Gilligan, who was sort of the counterpart of Kohlberg, then described a slightly different stage of morality that girls go through that is based, rather than being based on justice, is actually based on preserving the community and social connections. And so the dichotomy between Kohlberg and Gilligan is a very interesting kind of pairing. But what the two of them basically agreed on is that there's a sort of progression of the ability to understand moral judgments, understand right and wrong, and a very sort of simple way that children tend to progress. And I'll show you a brief clip of Clem's kids once again illustrating this, and then I think we'll conclude with that. So the way that morality was studied by Kohlberg and others is to ask a child a simple question. And the Heinz experiment was one where Heinz is a man whose wife is critically ill, and the druggist in the local town in Germany has invented a medicine that will cure his wife, but he's charging 30 times the actual cost of the medicine for it, and Heinz doesn't have the money, and so he steals it. And you ask the person, did he do the right thing? And how they answer tells you something about their understanding of morality. So this is a variation on that.
What about if someone was to steal something? You were in a store and you looked over and you saw a kid put a candy bar in their pocket. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Bad thing.
Bad thing. What would you do if you saw somebody do that?
I don't know.
Would you talk to the kid or talk to your mom or dad or something?
Mom and dad.
Yeah. Okay. What happens if your friend put it in your pocket and said, just walk out of the store with it. Just leave the store with it quick, let's go. And then we get free candy. What would you do?
Put it back.
Put it back? How come?
I don't want to get in trouble.
Don't want to get in trouble. Is it the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do?
Things are
Take
wrong
candy.
because you get in trouble if you
Wrong
do them.
thing to do. Okay.
How come it's wrong? What makes it wrong?
Because you're stealing.
But why is it important to follow rules?
So you don't get in trouble.
Mm-hmm. And why is it bad to steal something?
Because then you get arrested.
Is that the only bad thing?
No.
What?
Because it's mean.
Who's it mean to, or why is it mean?
It's mean to the store.
So he's interested in people outside of himself as well.
Or the store guy.
Yeah, why is it mean to them?
Because then they're losing something.
What are they losing?
They're losing something you steal.
Okay, yeah, losing. Yeah. So why do we have rules in this world?
Because then to make a better world.
Is it a better world if we say, like, what's a rule that they make to make the world better?
No littering.
No littering?
No drunk driving.
So if you throw some on the ground, that's against the rules? Yeah. Suppose you lived on an island by yourself, could you litter?
Probably.
If you made all the rules, right?
If you're the only person on that island.
Okay.
So he's expanded
Suppose your friend
a
did
little
it.
bit to sort of the
Like
people,
your best friend did
maybe
it.
a little bit about society.
I'd say, don't do that, Jack, or whatever my best friend's name would be. And it's not good, because it wouldn't really help anybody. I'll help you pay for that.
Okay.
Bye, UCF students.
All right, so those are some great examples, I think, of the developing morality of the young child. And what I was going to show here was a clip that probably many of you have seen, which is children playing with guns. And a lot of attention has recently been around how do we prevent children from, violence and using guns, and we've seen a lot of children dying in schools from the use of guns, and there's a lot of controversy about how to prevent that. And a lot of families who actually own guns will say, well, my child has been taught that guns are wrong, guns are dangerous, you never point a gun at somebody. And what these films consistently show is that the children whose parents say, my child will never touch a gun, my child knows guns are wrong, you put them in a room with a bunch of other kids and no parents around, and they pick up a gun and they point it at another child and they pull the trigger. Every single time. And I think the lesson from this, to me, is that you gotta understand something about how kids learn. If you wanna teach them the difference between right and wrong, if you wanna keep them safe. Obviously, the way to keep them safe is not to have them accidentally shoot somebody in the head and realize that guns can kill people, but you've gotta make it concrete, you've gotta make it real to them. There's no way that they're gonna understand the damage that can happen from a gun the way we understand it, watching the news, hearing about things. That's how we learn that things are dangerous. That's not how young kids learn that things are dangerous. So this is yet another example of how I think understanding the way kids learn and the way they develop and using teaching methods and education that is appropriate to their level of development can help us to keep our kids safe. Conclusions: love them, play with them, talk to them, be amazed by them. Those are the conclusions.